Good morning, y'all. How's everyone doing today? Thank you. Before we get into today's session, I've got a few housekeeping notes to go over. We are running our audience Q&A in this room via Slido. You can find this by opening the session listing in the South by Southwest Go app and clicking on the Engage button. Also, at 6 p.m. tonight, we have the South by Southwest Innovation Awards. This long-standing tradition celebrates some of the most exciting innovators here at South by Southwest. The ceremony and receptions provide for a full evening of fun, food, drinks, and networking. Now, with everything that's been happening in the US the last few years, conversations like this one are increasingly important. Rather than restricting civil liberties, we should be expanding those rights and making it easier for everyone to participate in the democratic process. Please join me in welcoming to the stage an incredible panel of speakers working to expand voting access to marginalized groups. Bradley Tusk, Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, Ralph G. Neas, Arndrea Waters King, and Martin Luther King III.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this. I'm Bradley Tusk. My day job is I'm a venture capitalist and do some stuff in politics, but the reason I am here is my foundation, Tusk Philanthropies, funds and runs the mobile voting project to make it possible for people to vote in upcoming elections on their phones. I'm going to ask the panelists to quickly introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump into questions.
Martin Luther King III, chairman of the board of the Drum Major Institute. Oldest son of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, human rights activist.
Arndrea Waters King, president of the Drum Major Institute. The Drum Major sermon was the very last sermon that Martin Luther King Jr. ever gave at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and it was played by Coretta Scott King during his funeral, and he very real sense eulogized himself, and we believe at Drum Major that his call is our pursuit.
I am Jocelyn Benson. I'm the Secretary of State in Michigan and work to protect every vote and ensure every voice is heard in our state as the Chief Election Officer and all around the country.
And my name is Ralph Neas. I'm the former Executive Director of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a coalition of 200 national organizations, the lobbying arm of the Civil Rights Movement. I was also the president of the People for the American Way. I'm the former chief counsel to two Republican senators, Senator Edward W. Brooke and Senator Dave Durnberger, part of an extinct species. And right now, I'm working on a new project to work with an Israeli startup that will be providing the ability of people with speech impairments to speak independently for the first time and be understood. Could affect approximately 500 million people around the world, so I'm quite excited, but I'm especially excited to be here today with you, and especially with Bradley and all of his efforts and what he has put together for us today.
All right, let's kick it off. Martin, if it's okay, I'm going to kick it off with you. So in the last 3 years alone, 19 states have passed 34 different laws to restrict voting rights. Why? What's happening here?
You know, that's a very good question. It's really perplexing that we go all over the world promoting democracy, and yet at home we're suppressing democracy. We ought to all be insulted by the fact that some of our elected officials are trying to make it harder to vote as opposed to expanding the franchise. The fact of the matter is, John Lewis and Hosea Williams walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965 and were beaten very badly along with others and hospitalized. And yet we had a Voting Rights Act for a number of years until 2013 when it was eviscerated by the Supreme Court. My higher point is there have been two pieces of legislation, John Lewis bill and the Freedom to Vote Act, that would permanently guarantee. An act only meant every 20 years we'd have to go back and redo it. But the Congress talked about liking John Lewis, but they won't support it. So until people engage all over this nation, and we're seeing a little bit of that. We saw it in 2018. We saw it in 2020. More people voted than ever before in 2020 because it was easy by getting materials to people so that people could vote. The voting departments would send out information. So my higher and final point is that until people are engaged, my dad and mom showed us throughout the modern civil rights movement that it only takes a few good women and men to be engaged, and we need to stay engaged, or we might lose our democracy.
Yeah, exactly. So, Ralph, following right up on that, then, you have said that the moment that we're in is the greatest internal threat to our democracy since the Civil War. What do you mean by that?
I'm not sure I feel stronger about anything than that statement. I'm glad you asked me that question. I had an opportunity to work on 4 Voting Rights Act extensions. They all passed with strong bipartisan support. The last one in 2006 passed the Senate 98-0, and it passed the House of Representatives 390-33. That's bipartisanship. That's consensus. 7 years later, one of the villains in this 2 or 3 minutes, John Roberts, the so-called moderate conservative on the court, wrote a 5-4 decision that gutted the enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act, the most successful civil rights law ever enacted, the heart and soul, really, of our democracy with respect to voting rights. That unleashed a tsunami of voter registration laws. And John Roberts deserves a lot of what happened, a blame from my perspective, in the next few years, with hundreds of thousands of people being disenfranchised through the country. And then we had Donald Trump in the 2020 election, which was the most successful election in terms of turnout in 100 years. We should have been patting ourselves on the back. What did he say? Election fraud. They stole the election. And that set in train a motion of many things, set in motion many things. 63 courts repudiated him. There was no election fraud that made any difference. And then we had January 6th, an armed insurrection. But what I want to talk about for a minute or two is after that, and Bradley mentioned the 19 states and the 34 voter suppression laws. We have going on, starting in late December, early January, 2021, 22, an unarmed insurrection. This is an unarmed insurrection that could disenfranchise millions of Americans, especially persons of color, people with disabilities, older Americans, veterans, a wide swath of the American public. And what did the Republican Senate do? Nothing. They allowed it to happen. Martin referred to what we try to do, and we'll keep on trying. But this has got to be nationwide, because guess what? In the last 3 or 4 weeks, another 150 voter suppression bills have been introduced in 32 states. Another 150, along with some legislation that would basically, I would consider election subversion and undermining the way we've always done business with nonpartisan election officials and making sure that votes are counted, not just cast. So when I say the most serious internal threat to our democracy, I believe it's absolutely accurate. We've got to make our top priority saving democracy from this moment on and for quite a while, I'm afraid. It's so important. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So, Jocelyn, there seems to be this disparity where politicians in a lot of states like restricting voting laws, but people in the real world actually want expanding voter opportunity and access. So your state, Michigan, there were referendums both in 2018 and 2022 on these questions. What happened and why?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. The reason why democracy thrives is when people stand up and demand that it does. You can't expect those who've gained power necessarily through one mechanism to necessarily support policies to change how power is granted in our country or in our states. It's historically only been when people stand and demand for a democracy that ensures every voice is heard and every vote is counted, that we actually see the changes that open up and create a more inclusive democracy, which in this moment is now more critical than ever. As our country becomes increasingly diverse, we have an opportunity to really, truly become a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy with shared and expanded power, inclusive power all across our country. Standing in the way of that are politicians who don't want to lose the traditional ways in which they've sought power and open it up to a more inclusive democracy. And so that's what we're seeing in many ways, what we've seen throughout the history of our democracy. And in Michigan, it's a beautiful story because it shows what happens when people organize and say, our voices count and our votes matter. We had an election in 2018 when I was first elected, along with our great governor, Gretchen Whitmer, and our Attorney General, Dana Nessel. And voters voted overwhelmingly to amend our state constitution in 2018 through 2 ballot initiatives to put citizens in charge of drawing our legislative districts, eliminating gerrymandering in our state, and also increase access to voter registration, meaning now you can register and vote up to and on election day itself instead of having to do that 30 days ahead of time, and also giving citizens a right to vote from home or absentee, which came in quite handy in 2020 during the pandemic. Bolstered by that success, we saw not just the highest turnout in our state's history in our primary and our general election in 2020, but citizens also energized again in response to backlash from Republican legislators who at the time were trying to roll back those changes that were in our Constitution, implement laws that would make it more difficult for us as election administrators to make real those rights that were now in our state Constitution. So citizens worked together again in 2022 to pass what they called version 2 of their amendment from 2018 that, among other things, ensured prepaid postage for absentee ballots was a guarantee. Drop boxes were guaranteed in communities around the state for citizens to return their ballots safely and securely if they did vote from home, and guaranteed 9 days of early voting all throughout our state for every citizen. So Michigan is really a story about how when citizens work together to ensure our democracy is open to all, it becomes open to all. And what the story of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Voting Rights Act, and our story in Michigan all collectively demonstrate is that only when citizens stand up and demand for their voting rights be protected, that they are actually protected.
That's a great answer. So, Arndrea, in building on that, 24 states and the District of Columbia during COVID did actually take positive steps to make it easier to vote. You studied all of these pretty closely. What are the ones that you particularly like? And if you had a magic wand that said, okay, I can continue these 3 things and do them everywhere, what would they be?
Well, certainly Michigan, as we just heard. But also I want to take one step back as well and go back to what Ralph said, because I think it's very important for us to actually draw a line for people to understand. Our daughter is the only grandchild of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. She's 14 years old. She'll be 15 in 2 months. She and her peers are sitting with fewer rights today than the day that they were born. This is the grandchild of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. When people always think about this year in August, we're going to observe 60 years of the March on Washington and I Have a Dream, and people always, if nothing else, they hear the line of my 4 children. And I can't imagine what he would say about the world in which his grandchild is now living. And the reason why that's so critical, and Ralph, I think the reason why you're saying it goes back to the Civil War, is because this is the first generation since Reconstruction that has fewer rights, particularly girl children, than their parents, than their grandparents, their great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. And we know that that's a slippery slope when laws are being used to oppress people. What we believe is that laws should lift us all up. What we are seeing with this type of legislation is laws that are literally limiting people. One of the things that we're doing also at the Drum Major Institute is that we're investing into community activism and activists, because that has always been the heartbeat of our democracy. I think people sometimes forget that Martin Luther King Jr., yes, he was a minister, and yes, he was a great orator and an academician, but he also was an activist. He was active. When he saw something that was wrong, he literally worked every day to try to right those wrongs. And so one of the things that we're passionate about is finding the modern day Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Coretta Scott Kings that are doing impactful work in their communities. And we saw the benefit of that with this last election. We have 40 groups that are in key swing states, and in every state there were victories because those groups are on the ground organizing. Whether we're talking about Pennsylvania, whether we're talking about Arizona, we have groups in Michigan. So what we also know is what happens when people come together and actually work, and when these communities are invested in. And we all know the problems, but when we all come together to talk about the solutions, that's when we can and we will, in fact, realize the dream once and for all of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, very, very well said. So one way, at least to me, to sort of empower a lot of the people that Arndrea was just talking about, and to really make it easier for young voters, voters of color, deployed military, people with disabilities, people who live in tribal communities, to cast their ballot, is to allow them to do so on their phone. We live in a world now where about 90% of Americans have some kind of smartphone, so this is not just a pipe dream. 7 states so far have allowed mobile voting, either for deployed military or people with disabilities. Interestingly, it's kind of been across the political spectrum, so the usual suspects like Colorado and Washington and Oregon, but also South Carolina and Utah and West Virginia. So, there seems to be a little progress on this front. Every one of those elections turnout more than doubled. Every one of those elections was independently audited by the National Cybersecurity Center, all came back clean. Out of my foundation, we've been building new technology to make it possible to vote on your phones that is completely encrypted and secure. We're going to release it this summer. It will be open source and free to anyone who wants to use it. So I think there's some real progress there. And Martin, you in a Washington Post op-ed called for bringing mobile voting to the District of Columbia specifically. Why'd you do that?
Well, first of all, let me also applaud you, Bradley, for the work that your foundation has done on this issue. It's kind of interesting that there are some who are, we should always come into a situation with our eyes open, but most of us, pay our bills online at some point, or many of us do. And I know I have been for a number of years. I hadn't received one call yet telling me my money didn't make it to where it was supposed to go. I'm not suggesting that things cannot be hacked, but it really should be about making it easier for any and everyone to participate. That makes that's really what will make our country great. When we have unencumbered, unfettered access that is legitimate. And again, for citizens, I should say for citizens. It's not just so that anyone can vote. And we have the technology ability, you're proving that, and so many others, that we can differentiate between who should and who should not. And when I say who should not, I'm very disappointed, for example, that there are still some states where a person who pays their debt to society cannot vote. I mean, that's taxation without registration. You've paid your debt. Maybe you did a crime, so you could not vote during that time. But then when you've paid your debt, your right should be restored. And there are still states in our country that won't allow people who've been convicted of crimes, certain crimes, to vote. That has got to change. We are really, in a sense, maybe not totally practicing democracy. We are practicing oppression. In fact, my dad used to say oppression is being legislated. It's tragic that 55 years after his death, this is April 4th, it's 55 years since he died. So oppression is once again being legislated all over, in many places in our country, not everywhere, but in more places than should be. We have got to figure out how to expand. When you look at a court system that we often went to expand the rights, now the court is retracting, specifically as we talk about women's rights. We saw that happen last year. We probably will see that with affirmative action and other things. The court not expands, but restricts. But the only way that changes is, again, people being involved, people organizing, people mobilizing, people being strategically focused. And so when we talk about mobile voting as one aspect of expanding the franchise, that's why I believe that we must do that. And yes, we need to make sure that there's all I's and all T's are dotted and crossed. But that can be done. What I know is it takes a few good women and men to bring about change. My dad and mom showed us that over and over and over again.
So, Ralph, you've been this passionate advocate for people with disabilities throughout your career, and I think what most people don't understand is that, if you have a disability, especially let's say you're blind, going to a polling place is exceedingly difficult. So you've championed ideas like vote by mail, mobile voting, but I don't think most people really understand what people with disabilities face when they try to vote. Can you just explain it to the audience?
That's such a good point. We've made so much progress with respect to people with disabilities, thanks to the ADA and other laws, and the numbers have increased significantly over the last 15 years. But to say that we're anywhere close to being where we want to be would be totally inaccurate. There's still a lot that has to be done, and I too salute for the work on mobile voting and salute you for reaching out to get people in the cybersecurity community to partner with you. But people have got to be realistic about things that are not generally known as to why, even with the right and the laws, people with disabilities have special challenges. They could be transportation challenges, how you are able to go to the polls or to participate in any way. They could be the location of the polling place. The GAO did a study just a couple of years ago that 2/3 of the voting places have impediments that make it more difficult for persons with disabilities. And the numbers about who do have problems with respect to staff that really don't know how to be able to address the inaccessibility. They're not trained. And the equipment themselves are not in a position to help people with disabilities. The list goes on in terms of how we've got to make an extra special effort to understand the distinctions and to make sure, for example, blind people, we've talked a little bit about this before the program, and how especially difficult it is. And only about 50% of blind voters think they've had a good experience at the poll and were able to vote without a problem. And then when you have them receiving, for example, electronically, mail ballots, that seems like that does it for them. It does not do it for them. In fact, it's only the beginning when they receive that, because there's also a requirement in most states to make sure that it's verified, that there's a signature, there has to be a printer involved. Many people with disabilities do not have printers, and the burden it puts on them to get that done and then physically deposit at a drop box or somewhere else takes a lot of time and effort. It's a tremendous disincentive, and we have to take that into consideration.
So, Arndrea, you've studied the youth vote and kind of thought about what we can do about it, and you mentioned you have a 14-year-old, so you're sort of familiar. I have teenagers too, and this is a generation that does seem politically engaged in the sense that they're aware of issues, they talk about issues, but then when they turn 18, especially like in local primaries, which is really the elections where governance actually gets decided, they're 15 times less likely to vote. What do we do about this?
Well, I think that it's always important for us to remember whenever there is any type of new innovation or new ideas, it is certainly most readily met with skepticism and restriction. I think that having young people mobile voting And this issue is something that's extraordinarily important, particularly to the young vote, because they're on college campuses. Not all young people are in college, but they certainly being able to vote mobily, because you're in between physical addresses. I think that, being able to have access that's easily and readily accessible. And I think we also have to realize that this generation is growing up with an intuitive knowledge of and comfort with being able to operate mobily. And so for them, I think it also makes something that all too often may seem antiquated or cumbersome. It makes it seem a lot more is talking their language and interfacing in a way in which they can understand. And even if you're not on a college campus, younger people tend to be more often than not between addresses. So, being able to have, flexibility in voting that way. And then also the fact with young people and all of the different issues that are impacting them, I think that they also in a lot of ways are a lot more knowledgeable about all of these issues, and they want to become involved and engaged, but they want to do it in a way that is easier for them and less cumbersome.
Great. So, Jocelyn, you've done a lot of work around giving people who are deployed abroad in the military better access to voting. Ralph explained really well what the challenges that people with disabilities face when they try to vote. I don't think most people realize that there's also significant challenges if you are deployed abroad, protecting our right to vote, no less. Can you explain both what it's like if you're deployed military and then the work that your office is doing to try to improve it?
Yeah, I'm happy to, because I have a personal experience as a military spouse, and my husband was deployed in Afghanistan in 2012 during the 2012 presidential cycle. And as someone who's devoted my whole career to voting rights and democracy, it's certainly a gut punch to come home from doing that work and find his ballot returned undeliverable, which he mailed from Afghanistan to vote in the August 2012 primary, and mailed it ahead of time, did everything he was supposed to do. But through the mail and failures of the delivery process, it never got to the clerk's office in time to be counted. And knowing that I had that experience, I realized that it's not just about, you could know everything that you're supposed to know and do everything you're supposed to do, and still our men and women serving abroad and their families and their dependents who are stationed overseas, as well as millions of overseas Americans, have unique struggles in getting and ensuring, particularly when you're voting from a war zone, that your voice is heard and that your ballot is counted. And so I've worked for the last 10 years since that moment, and now as the state's chief election officer, to ensure that we are simply doing what a lot of other states already do, to ensure both that we are able to electronically transmit safely and securely ballots to our deployed service members and their families, and now working on legislation to ensure that they can return it similarly. We need to ensure alongside of that we're building out a system that is secure, that citizens can have faith and confidence in, and also that there is a paper trail so that we can do appropriate audits as is necessary for our laws and other laws. All of that's possible, however, and in my view, at the end of the day, especially chief election officers and election administrators and the lawmakers that help us do our jobs and fund our work and through the legislative funding process, we need to ensure we're meeting people where they are and doing everything we can to get their votes delivered on time and ensure that they're counted. That's our job. And even in moments like this where democracy is uniquely under attack, it's all the more important that we're building citizens' confidence in the process and doing everything we can to engage everyone in having their voice heard. So that's an example of how we have to look at different communities like our military service members, like those with disabilities, like citizens in marginalized communities who often don't have access to the same even information about where to go and vote, returning citizens, many others. So some of the beauty of democracy work is meeting every voter where they are and building out a system that's safe, secure, accessible truly to everyone.
Okay, so this is a question for the whole panel, which is, what's the most common excuse you hear from people who want to restrict voting rights, and what's been the most outlandish one? And anyone here can jump in first when it pops into your head. Jocelyn,
I mean, I've heard that people deserve to have the freedom not to vote. which is okay. I mean, that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to doing everything we can to make sure people have the option to vote. I think that generally in politics, and I came to politics as an academic and a voting rights advocate who started my career in Montgomery, Alabama, investigating hate groups and hate crimes, and always making data-driven decisions to protect people, to protect democracy. And so really the most outlandish thing to me is how many folks with power who are lawmakers don't make data-driven decisions about what's best for everyone, whether it comes to democracy or climate change or any other issue of the day, keeping kids safe in schools and all the rest, and how much gamemanship and just games play a role in determining the laws of the land as opposed to data. And that's, I think, where folks who are outside of the political arena have a real role to play in helping to inform the process and support leaders who will make data-driven decisions on both sides of the aisle about what's right. Because I know when it comes to our democracy, there's plenty of research and data out there on exactly what we need to do to ensure we're continuing to modernize how we run our democracy, how we run elections, how we build voter confidence in our elections. And too often there's not the political will to actually follow up on that research and make it real. And that's why, to me, I not only wear the Edmund Pettus Bridge on my wrist to remind me of the work and the sacrifice that was made so that we could have a democracy for all, but the quote of that we must always not do what's politic, but we must do what's right, from your father, from Martin Luther King, Dr. King Jr., that guides me every day to realize that real leadership is not doing what's politic, it's doing what's right.
If only other politicians took that lead, Martin,
Well,
please.
it's funny because Jocelyn and I have in common both working to eradicate hate crimes and hate groups. So for anybody who wants to start in that career, look where it can lead you.
We'll have a second panel right after this one.
But also, that organization that I worked for was founded by Reverend C.T. Vivian and Ann Braden. Reverend C.T. Vivian was a tremendous tower in not only working with Martin's father, but also, certainly in the Nashville Sit-In movements, Greensboro movements. And then also Ann Braden was mentioned in the letter from the Birmingham jail as a white Southerner that was in the fight for black freedom and equality. So to work and to be mentored by two people who actually literally did change the course of our democracy, I know that this work is not theoretical. This is real, and the results are real. And we were recently in Oakland, and one of the things that I said to the young people out there, and what I say a lot of times to young people that, that particularly marginalized communities that have every right to be tired. But what I said to them and what I say to young people, all over this nation is if you don't think that your right to vote is powerful, why are they trying so hard to take that right away from you?
Absolutely. Martin?
I would say two things. Number one, people want elected officials to be accountable and feel like the process has not worked for them. And so they have an attitude, why should I vote? Now, that's one issue that has to be addressed in accountability. We got to figure out how do we not just hold people accountable, but how we engage in such a way that the issues that we are concerned about are getting addressed. The other thing that I think is critically important is, and I want to use this example, young people have to decide they're going to engage also. Now, what do I mean by that? If you go to college, now it doesn't have to be just college, but at the college level, if you go to college and you're in the military, you're in the ROTC. When you graduate from college, you're a lieutenant, which is a commanding officer in the military. So if you can command troops at 21 years old, can't you also run for city council, run for county commissioner, run for state representative or state senator? Most of those, and even mayor in some cases. I think one of the youngest mayors in the country of a small city is like 18, 19 years old. Until young people are engaged in the process, we're going to continue to miss young people. Young people need to be involved. Now, I'm an older person, so I'm not against old people. But, the average age in the Congress is probably like 60-something years old. So, we got new up and young upcoming folks who are there, but we need more young people in the process. When we have young people on school boards, we'll see different our whole education system, by the way, needs to be restructured. We've been teaching people the same way for hundreds of years, and there are like 25 ways that you can learn, and yet we focus on one or two and wonder why we're losing people every day. There's something wrong with that, and that's why we may be losing our competitive edge around the world. We need to lead again, and again, that takes organization, mobilization, and that takes voting. Dad used to say that a voteless people is a powerless people. And one of the most important steps we can take is that short step to the ballot box.
That's right. So Ralph, Martin just talked pretty eloquently about, how do we get young people more inspired and more engaged? Some people advocate for lowering the voting age from 18 to 16. Do you support that?
I think I do. I do. A number of years, relatively recently, I probably wouldn't. But having talked with my young daughter, I married late and it took a long time, but she's 23. And she's been talking about these issues with me, especially climate change and the environment and what's happening during the Trump years and what's going to happen to my life and my life with my friends. If we can do some of the things that people have talked about, and Martin, what you just said about civic education and making that a central part of our children's education so they're up on the issues and they can cast a meaningful vote, I think I lean in favor of it, Bradley. I do.
Jocelyn, are you allowed to answer this question, or do you feel like it's sort of putting you in too much of a bind?
Well, I mean, we're working in Michigan on legislation to allow pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. We have automatic voter registration so that when you get your driver's license, you're automatically registered to vote if you're an eligible citizen. And a lot of people get their driver's license at 16 and then, they register to vote at 18. So things like that will help us address and ensure people are registered and able to vote right away. And one of the other policies that we've now implemented in Michigan is election day registration, as I mentioned earlier. And in every election, whether it's a local election, a state election, or a federal election, the vast majority of people who take advantage of that ability to register and vote on election day are 18 and 19-year-olds. And so in my view, I think elections need to be built to meet people, as I mentioned, where they are. And if citizens want that, if they want to be able to vote at younger ages, well, I think in Michigan we'll certainly see that emerge from our citizens and then build out to that. But our work is really focused on making sure that we are reducing barriers for young people and for this new generation that will be inheriting our democracy in the decades to come. And that's why I think conversations like this one are so important. How do we ensure that we're building a democracy for tomorrow? How do we ensure that we're preparing for election administration of 2040, of 2050? And what do the young voters of today tell us by their actions, by their participation, that we will need to plan for and prepare for in the years ahead?
Arndrea, 16, what do you think?
Well, when you think about the fact that every major movement, certainly in this country, and even if you look at it globally, have been led by young people. Even during the civil rights movement, you had SNCC, so our daughter, who is an activist in her own right and constantly engaged in these dialogues, tells us all the time, with the data to back it up, how elections would have turned out differently if the younger citizens were able to vote. So I think that when you think about what's going on, you think about the education that they have and the fact that they are going to be the one to inherit all of these. I do think with the proper education that we should look at 16-year-olds being able to cast a vote in this country.
Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, I concur.
All right, so we've got a full unanimity that we're going to let 16-year-old vote. There's a ton of questions from the audience. I, of course, can't read them, so I'm going to hop down there, and then I will address them to you guys. So the first one comes from Rochelle Riley. How can we convince people voting is a civil rights issue when we can't convince people that voting is a duty? Now we're competing with Nick Jonas down the hall. So, and for context, Nick Jonas has his own panel here, and so I guess at least Rochelle would argue that this might be a little more important than whatever it is Nick is talking about. So what's the answer to Rochelle's question?
Well, I mean, we passed Nick Jonas backstage. We could have brought him out with us and then just combined the panels and all talk about democracy. But I think, I mean, one of the most relevant and as Ralph was saying, critical issues of this moment is protecting our democracy from a very nationally coordinated effort to diminish people's faith in their voice mattering. And so we see the impact of that, and it sort of combines with disillusionment and disengagement that people feel overall when those who are our elected leaders are not necessarily listening to or making decisions to advance the interests of their citizens, their voters, and people who have elected them. So, and to focus on Michigan, we've become a really great example, laboratory, if you will, of what can happen if citizens do get engaged. We now have enshrined in our state constitution fundamental rights for women's reproductive freedoms because people organized and made it happen. We have enshrined the right to vote in our state constitution. We've eliminated gerrymandering in Michigan because people have gotten engaged. And with each success, we are seeing more and more engagement from young voters, from older voters, all across the spectrum, even in marginalized communities. When you combine that with administrators who go to prisons and ensure returning citizens are registered and get proper identification and driver's licenses, all of which is needed to reintegrate into society, which my office does, that enables sort of full flow of voting to be both relevant and for people to see the effects of their participation, the real change that has happened solely because people have been engaged and participating. And too often we don't tell that story throughout history, but when we look back, even the civil rights movement, it's only because people got engaged and marched and demonstrated and stood for freedom and equality and rights for everyone that there was any change at all. And so I think we need to both be telling those stories more, which we know there's also a movement against trying to stop from happening. We need to live those stories more by showing up for the inequities of today and demanding change. And then elected leaders need to essentially open the way for that change to actually happen by listening to the citizens who elect them and ensuring more participate and are engaged. But the good news is, I have seen in Michigan the impact of all that, and that a lot of yes, here we are at a flashy South by Southwest and all the rest, and it is hard to get people in different industries focused on one of the most connecting tissues that we have as Americans, which is our democracy. But at the same time, we've seen at the local level, and you see this all around the country, when you do have organizing and it does lead to change, that is actually what can get people engaged and involved. So I'm optimistic because turnout is increasing in Michigan. People are continuing to be engaged. We recruited 30,000 new election workers, poll workers in Michigan over the last several years. And so people will rise up when their rights are threatened. And they can, if government enables that, they can effectively ensure those rights are protected. And I'm optimistic that we can continue to see that in states around the country. And it's up to all of us to communicate, tell these stories, and for every one of you here today to go out there and tell the story of what you've heard today and get more people engaged to really access the power they have to build a society that is inclusive and reactive to all.
And I also would say once again what I said earlier, whenever you're talking to young people or anyone who thinks that their vote or their voice doesn't matter, is if you think that you don't matter, why are they trying so hard to take your voice and your vote away? And also, I would remind all of us, we are coming very close to April 4th, which will this year be 55 years since Martin's father, my father-in-law, was assassinated. And he gave his last sermon at the Washington Cathedral. And in that, he talked about remaining awake during a revolution. You know, it's kind of ironic lately that the term woke is being actually used in a derogatory manner when the very last sermon that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered, his message to all of us was to stay awake. And that's what I would urge all of us to do today, to continue. Don't let your voice be taken away, and to continue to be woke and be proud of being woke, and know that the attacks on being woke is those that are trying to take the voices of the voiceless back.
They made the text a little bigger, so I think I can now read it from my seat. There's two questions I'm going to combine, and they both essentially ask a similar question, which is how do we get mobile voting to be approved by Republicans? Why won't they just stop this as they've tried to stop every other expansion? Martin?
Okay, I'm glad you said that way, because I was going to say you got to change Congress, which means participation. And the people who are standing in the way, you know, I don't want to just be partisan and make a universal blanket indictment against all Republicans, but that's who's standing in the way, quite frankly. If you want progress, it doesn't mean that Democrats exclusively going to create progress, because we do need bipartisanship. But we do have to change. I mean, think about the fact that we had gun legislation, for anybody who might be interested. I use that as an example because, you know, I am for the Second Amendment, but I'm very concerned about what is happening with guns, and everybody wants a bigger and better gun and a more gun that shoots more people quicker. And, you know, when the students at Douglas Parkland High School in Parkland, Florida, Douglas Stoneman High School, Parkland, Florida, they stood up, and then in 2018, Congress changed, and there was legislation passed then, and then in 2020, only on the House side. Now, that was the same thing with voting rights, because you had a majority, and in 2020, you know, today the Democrats say they have a majority, but you can't get any legislation done. The Republicans regained 5 seats. Think about that, 5 seats. Out of things where people were projected to say, oh, the economy is all folded, and gas was high. All of that's true, by the way. But yet Americans came out and said, look, all these people who are election deniers, these secretaries of states, every last one of them lost. That's because the people engaged. And instead of 40 seats that they said they were going to win, they won 5. Interestingly, all of them were in New York. Don't you live there? Anyway,
it was a New York Post election. Yeah.
But my higher point is, you know, we need to evaluate all of these things. And the real point is to continue to have engagement. My dad, my mom, so many others have given their lives and shown us when we stay engaged, we make progress. The major goal ought to be to get everybody in our country participating. That makes our democracy better. Not 67% and thinking, oh, that's great, 67% of the voters voted. There are countries where they're over 90%, and they're not countries that are necessarily fascist. But there are countries where, you know, 89, 90% vote regularly. And so why are we, who's supposed to be leaders, not doing that? There's something in terms of the process that we have to continue to change. Certainly things that Jocelyn is doing in Michigan, and there are other states where little things are happening. This state of Texas has, in my judgment, some major problems that we're not talking about. I don't know all those problems, so I won't enumerate them today, but I know there are specific problems in Texas because Texas is a state that's in transition, and people have to be engaged if we're going to move. The question is, do we want to move backward or do we want to move forward? I always hope that we're looking forward. You have to understand that a people that do not remember their history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. There's something wrong in a nation where today we're trying to unwrite the history of the past because people are afraid to deal with the truth. It is said that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. But yet we don't want to know the truth, so we want to suppress. That's why there's issues like critical race theory, which really doesn't exist and yet is only taught in law school, that some, happen to be Republicans by and large, have basically said, we don't want critical race theory, which is basically saying you can't teach black history. I mean, I'm here in Texas, and they use my father's speech where he talked about having the right of his 4 little children to not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. They use that, and then they said you can't teach Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream in this state where we're sitting today. And we act like That's all right. Did they forget every January there's a national holiday? So you're going to have to talk about King at some point. I'm not suggesting he should only be talked about, but certainly, you know, you're talking about Rosa Parks. You can't, Rosa Parks' books are being banned. I mean, Rosa Parks helped change this nation in a positive way. She didn't violently come and hurt anyone. She was sitting down in the black section, by the way. And the law in Alabama said, well, you got to move. If white folk get on the bus, black folk have to move out of their section. Now, I don't mean to sound angry, but I need to deal with truth and reality, because if we're not understanding the truth, and that's why they don't want us to know certain history, because they don't want you to know the truth so that you can be set free. And I'm talking about everybody. This is not just for black folk. This is for all people. All people need to know the history so that we do not repeat it, and so that we can treat everybody with humanity and dignity and respect. And that's largely what my dad and mom and, you know, our team is about. It's really about opening doors, knocking down barriers that are negative to create a positive environment so that we can all make our nation a better nation for all of God's children.
So, Martin, just to follow up on your point on guns, it's a really good example, and at least to me, it seems, more pick on Republicans here, but let's keep doing it then. Let's say you're a Republican congressman from Florida, right? You probably know that it's crazy that someone could walk into a store and walk out with an AK-47. But at the same time, turnout in your primary is 12%. Your district is gerrymandered, so only the primary matters. And half of the 12% are NRA members, which means you have to choose between keeping your seat and doing the right thing. And as we know, politicians will choose keeping their seat, other than Jocelyn, every single time. How do we defy this?
So again, while that, again, maybe intellectually that's something you can understand, but at some point you have to take position. My dad used to say the ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in times of comfort and convenience, but where you stand in times of challenge and controversy. And when it comes to controversy, I believe that and hope that more people will take a position that's right. Unfortunately, most of us take the position that's expedient for us. And the only way you change that is you get more people involved and participating so that you can elect someone to office who will. It's not, I mean, I think you can really support the national NRA, National Rifle Association, whatever it is. I say that, look, my dad was killed when I was 10 years old by a gun. My grandmother was killed when I was 16. Most people don't know that, by a gun, assassinated. My dad and my grandmother. I should be the first one. I want to have as many guns as I can to protect myself. I should have that position. But no, I chose a different path. And I'm thankful for that example of my grandfather and my grandmother and my grandparents and aunts and uncles and my mother, and what was it, reinforced through the church. Because I learned that you have to dislike the evil act and still love the individual. Now, I'm not telling everybody you have to be like me. I'm just saying what has worked for me. I was taught to love myself, to love my family, to love my community, and to love God. And all of that has worked for me. So I've learned to navigate without having or holding on to hostility and anger, because I know that we won't be able to be successful through anger. But for those who embrace that and internalize that, that's fine. We've got a society we have a society that's dysfunctionally functional. That sounds like an oxymoron. It probably is. But that's the truth. I mean, look at the things that we do over and over again. I mean, people go in and kill folk, and instead of saying, you know, maybe we need to stop making bullets, that's an extreme position, or do something to keep people so that people are not able to kill people, and yet we continue to do more and more and nothing. We really are doing nothing about the issue. Elected officials are the ones who are going to be able to change that. But we have to elect people who have the sensitivity, the compassion, who have the heart to want to make us a much better nation. I know we can do it. It's not going to happen overnight. This is unfortunately not a sprint. It needs to be, but it's a marathon. All of the work my dad and mom and others have done, you know, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act in 65, and fair housing legislation in 68. These were marathons. We're involved in marathon activities, but they will create changes.
That's great. So we're probably down to the last question, and I want to ask it to each of you because there are people here in the audience who are wondering, okay, I agree with the four of you. What do I do about it? And people watching on the live stream and everything else. So give me two tangible things that a regular person in watching the four of you speak can now go do to try to help on this issue. So Ralph, you want to kick that off?
We've covered some really important points in just the last few minutes. And getting involved in civic engagement, getting involved in political campaigns, getting involved in a way that you think will make a difference. There's so much out there, and what I love about these last few questions, answered and not answered, is that change is going to happen, as some have said, at the local level. We've got to build movements if we're going to change Congress. And you can have a tangible result if you get involved in a meaningful way and organize and try to make people understand things can change. Ranked choice voting and mobile voting, I think, are the two most important new changes. You're so smart to do it on the local and national level. I hope it's also going to be ballot initiatives as well as state. But things that we can win on and build confidence, build the organizations, and we can convert it into things that will change Congress, and that will change the national laws.
Great. Jocelyn?
I have three.
Okay.
One, sign up to be an election worker in your community. You can go to, there's various websites, vote.org. You just Google, I want to be an election worker, I want to be a poll worker, and serve as a poll worker, not just in this next election, but consider doing it in 2024. The presidential election cycle, we are going to need people of integrity who believe in democracy to protect the ability of everyone to vote. So wherever you are, wherever you vote, sign up to be a poll worker and do that work. Secondly, think about an issue in your community that you want to see change. Whether it's safety from gun violence, whether it's better funded education, more support for teachers, and contact your local representative in both the state and federal level, set up a meeting with them and ask them what they're doing to change that. Whatever issue, climate change, and I mean, just that one act elevates that issue for the person who's showing up to work every day, we hope, advocating for the issues that their people care about, and build that connectivity between, or if you're thinking about running for office, don't wait. Get your name on that ballot and put yourself out there and define your future and the future for your community. The third thing is tell everyone about this conversation today through social media and other channels. There's lots of work that the Drum Major Institute is doing, for example, and that we're doing in Michigan and that our organizations are doing on a regular basis to provide more entryways to not just engage and protect democracy in this moment, but speak the truth about what our democracy is and is not. What it is a vehicle for change, and it only can serve as that vehicle if people demand that change comes through it. And that's what you all can help us do. And if we can all do that, history teaches us through the civil rights movement and other examples throughout history that our rights will be protected despite the ongoing rollback, that our voting rights will be protected despite hundreds of bills trying to make their way through legislators. If we stand up and say, we're going to stand for our democracy and our fundamental rights and freedoms every day and do everything we can to protect them, they'll be protected.
Arndrea?
I see peace, justice, and equity almost as eternal flames, and those we'll have to feed them by each generation. Eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. So I would say to do your part and continue to feed the flames of peace, justice, and equity, to see yourself as a part of the King legacy, to know and understand that when you hear about the beloved community or hear about Martin's parents, that in a very real sense, each one of us are heirs to the beloved community, but it only becomes a reality when we're doing our part to build that. To be of service, to find something that you're passionate about, and to serve humanity. And then also at the Drum Major Institute, we do have 40 groups that are doing impactful work on the ground in communities all across the country, and to become involved or engaged with some of those groups or in some groups in your community.
Okay, Mark, we got 43 seconds left. Bring us home.
Okay, all I can say is two things. We need to target our senators and our congresspersons and at the state legislative level as well as the national level. That is using the technology that you make TikTok videos talking about it. Do Facebook, Twitter. That is really what's going to cause engagement. And finally, I say don't give in, don't give out, don't give up. We can make it happen. Just a few good women and men can change our nation for the better for generations yet unborn.
That is perfect. Let's give a big hand for our panel. Really spectacular for all of them. Thank you guys all so much for being part of this.